And welcome everyone to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. Let me just inform you, as I normally do, we're the UK's largest pro-marriage organisation. Tens of thousands of people up and down the country, coming from all faiths and none, to celebrate this notion of one man, one woman marriage and to promote it in society as something which adds something unique and special to civil society. It's great for adults, it's great for children especially, and it's absolutely marvellous for society in general. And as I often say, that's not to imply that other things don't exist in a liberal democracy. Of course they do. But what we focus on is the unique contribution that one man, one woman marriage brings to society. We want to promote that, want to celebrate that, because it is something very, very special. And it's an absolute joy to have with us today. I've been waiting for this interview for some time with anticipation. Professor Brad Wilcox from the USA. First of all, before I introduce your credentials, Brad, do you want to say hello to our listeners and our viewers?
It's great to be with you, Tony. Thank you for having me here today.
Brad, what a joy it is. Now, you are director of something called the National Marriage Project in the US. You're a professor of sociology, University of Virginia. Yeah, you're a senior fellow in the Institute of Family Studies. You're a scholar for the American Enterprise Institute. You've written books. You've written countless articles in peer-reviewed journals and international press. One recently appeared, The Case for Marrying Young, if you like, which has picked up by a lot of press over here. And perhaps we can touch on that. But let's begin. Just tell us your subject specialities, if you like. What are you a specialist in?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I studied at Princeton in sociology, got my PhD there, and focused there on culture, religion, and family for my doctorate in sociology at Princeton.
And you look at matters surrounding marriage and family, cohabitation. You look at how they affect the lives and the outcomes of people and how all of that has an impact on civil society. And let's start off, first of all, a lot of your research is based on the wonderful stats base that exists in the US, which we don't really have in the UK. But it seems like in the US, you've got a huge resource of statistics on just about anything and everything to do with, your 300 million plus population. Tell us a little bit about that and how useful that is.
So what we do see in the United States, as you said, is a lot of different statistical resources, from the General Social Survey, which is done by Chicago, and they are always kind of looking at American trends, including family trends, to what's called the NLSY, which is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor. And there are many other surveys. And I think what's striking about looking at this data in the United States is how much it kind of reinforces the importance of marriage and family. In fact, we just got a new poll out from YouGov here in the U.S. Showing just dramatic, about 20 percentage point differences in the United States between Americans who are married and those who are not in terms of their levels of complete satisfaction. So this is just kind of like the most recent evidence that the kinds of issues we're talking about today really matter for ordinary people. And again, the data in the US could not be clearer on that score.
And any other key messages from the data? So you're looking at obviously huge benefits there for adults in terms of life satisfaction. What about kids, and what about outcomes for children?
Well, I think one of the more fascinating things that I'm seeing in the data now is, I've been, beating the marriage drum as you have for a long time. There's no doubt there's just tons of research on that score. But what's interesting to me about the more recent data that I've been looking at is it's suggesting that both for kids actually and also for adults, that marriage matters more than ever. Again, marriage matters more than ever. I was at an academic conference in Maine, in the US in August, and was talking to a colleague there, and she was speculating that, because people are more tolerant and people are, more live and let live and all this kind of stuff, that sort of the importance of marriage and family structure would be less consequential for kids today. And when you actually look at the research, though, you find that she has got it exactly wrong. So we have new research we've just done at the Institute for Family Studies, where I'm also a fellow, looking, for instance, at kids being held back in school and kids being suspended and expelled from their schools. What we're finding is that in the more recent cohorts today, the relationship between having intact married parents and not being suspended and expelled, not being held back in school, for instance, is stronger than it was, 20 years ago, roughly speaking. We see other research, on that same score from scholars at Northwestern and other places. So what I'm suggesting to you, Tony, is it's not just that marriage matters for kids today, it's that marriage matters more than ever. And I'm also happy to talk about how that's also, I think, the case for men and women as well today.
Yeah. So growing up with your biological mum and dad in a marital relationship seems to make a big difference for children's outcomes.
Exactly. And I think part of what's happening there is that today, dads are more involved, they're more engaged. And so the benefit of having two stably married parents or your own parents is that you have on scene a mom who's pretty engaged, oftentimes, obviously, and then also a father who's increasingly engaged. Whereas if you don't have your parents, both parents on the home front, you're more likely to be relatively disadvantaged today compared to those kids who have engaged mom and engaged dad right there at home with them.
Mm-hmm. And that's lots of different things, from just time with children, spending time with them, all the way through to things like additional income that's commensurate with people who are married. Right. Lots of things. Even, dads, you do a lot of work on fatherlessness and the impact of fatherlessness, which is, an unsung pandemic in our society. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. It's also the case, too. We did a report last Father's Day here in the US in 2021, just indicating that when it comes to incarceration, when it comes to college graduation, when it comes to child poverty, there's just a very large gap between kids who are being raised by a home with their father there and kids who are being raised in a home without their married dad on scene. So, you're just much less likely to get in trouble with the police, and you're more likely to be flourishing in school and graduating from college if you have the benefit of, your married dad there on scene. So that's certainly part of the story here. And all of this research is kind of thinking again about the role that dads play. They tend to have a distinctive approach, to parenting. They play more with their kids in terms of like rough physical play, rough and tumble play, as it's called in the literature. They're more likely to challenge their kids to embrace life's opportunities and to endure life's difficulties. And they also then, even today, in married families, bring in the lion's share of money. And we all know that money matters for kids' welfare, from everything from housing, schooling to, unfortunately, today, at least in the US, sports. What we're seeing in the US is that sports, unfortunately, are becoming more and more expensive to play for our kids. And so having a dad who's in the household, ponying up, hundreds of dollars sometimes, for kids' sports stuff is also part of the story we're seeing. So dads matter as well in this whole picture.
I read something interesting about dads teaching children how to suffer properly. Not in a terrible sense, but how to put up with stuff and how to cope with life, if you like. And we've got, there seems to be an awful lot of kids who are just raging at society because they don't know how to cope with the least bit of suffering or when things go even slightly wrong.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of research on that. Funny kind of study just across the channel from you there in the UK, looking at parents in France and toddlers learning how to swim. And what they found when they looked at moms and dads in the study is that moms tended to hold the toddlers, face to face, eye to eye, in the water. Mom is that source of security, and she's a much more, typically on average, cautious with the little kids. By contrast, when dad's in the water with the toddler, turned around, the kid is facing what we call Duke and Alton out into the deep, right? And so that's just kind of it's both a kind of a literal kind of confirmation of your comment there, but also kind of, metaphorically, dads are pushing their kids out into the deep, in life, not just in that pool. And kids need both that sort of security that moms tend to provide on average. They need that challenge, that push into the deep that dads tend to deliver in a different way.
And that's the thing, that on a population level, mums and dads bring very different things to the table. So that's why you kind of need both. And you're always going to get examples of, a masculine mum and a feminine dad in terms of their approach or characteristics or traits. But on a population level, it's very different.
Exactly. And I think what we tend to lose sight of in our conversations today is that there's always someone who can say, well, my experience doesn't conform to that, generalization. I was raised, for instance, by a single mother, and I've turned out, I think, in most respects, okay. My sister is flourishing as well. But I can also say, as a sociologist, that on average, kids are more likely to flounder when they don't have the benefit of married parents on the home front.
And again, this isn't a value judgment. This is a question of looking at the data and what happens in real life based on large-scale data across time and across cultures, if you like. It seems to be very, very consistent. In terms of marriage then, you also look at cohabitation. And often get the question, well, what's so important about marriage? Isn't it just a piece of paper? Why should it be any different than cohabitation?
Yeah, when I teach to my students at the University of Virginia, I think one of the most surprising things that they kind of learn in my sociology of family class is that cohabitation is not a great way to prepare for marriage. The vast majority of my students, the vast majority of American young adults, and probably true in the UK as well, assume that cohabiting with someone before you marry them is the best way to do things. And what we see in the research, though, is that people who cohabit prior to marriage are more likely to get divorced, and they're more likely to be unhappy in their marriages. And I think this is about a couple of different things. One issue today, especially, is that what we're seeing is that people are cohabiting with more than one partner. The cohabitation is not kind of like a guaranteed path to marrying that person, right? So the problem with that is that it's particularly the case that cohabiting with multiple partners is very risky for your marital success down the road. There's just something about that experience of having like set up a household with more than one person, with someone besides your future spouse, that is very strongly linked to marital problems and to divorce. So I think that's one issue when it comes to cohabitation. Better just to kind of like wait, and set up a household with your spouse, after the wedding date, and try things out with multiple people is one of the takeaways here. But I think another piece that we're seeing is that people who cohabit prior to marriage, I think, are more likely to adapt a more kind of individualistic and consumeristic mindset to their marriage and to their relationship. And that doesn't serve them well. So just one example there, we see, for instance, folks who cohabit prior to marriage are more likely to set up and maintain separate checking accounts. And I mean, there's been a piece in the Atlantic that celebrates, separate checking accounts. This is wonderful, right? But in reality, what we're seeing is that couples who have shared accounts, who pool their money together, who sort of have themselves thinking as a we before me thing on lots of issues and lots of fronts, including money, are much more likely to flourish. In fact, there was one study at Northwestern that found that when young newly married couples were randomly assigned to separate accounts and to joint accounts, it was the couples who were assigned to joint accounts who were much more likely to be flourishing early on in their marriage. So anyways, the point being simply that I think cohabitation often sets people up for, patterns, behaviors, mentalities that aren't so great, particularly when they're cycling through a number of relationships prior to the wedding day.
And it's that concept of two becoming one, isn't it? And financially, as well as anything else, that you become one unit.
Yeah, I think obviously the more you have a we before me, what I call a we before me mindset, the better. And I think it's also the case too, having the sense that you're kind of crossing a threshold, a unique and powerful threshold. I was talking to one couple, for instance, young professional couple met in New York City, very successful folks. She was in theater, he was in finance. And unlike their peers, they decided not to cohabit before marriage. Moved down to Dallas, Texas recently, wrote this up in the Wall Street Journal. And what she said was that, moving into their apartment together in Dallas as a married couple was just so magical. I mean, she said even like, cooking a meal together, doing the laundry together, decorating for Christmas together. These were all things that we were doing first as a married couple. And by contrast, their peers who cohabited prior to marriage often would kind of tell them, like, yeah, marriage is it's not really different than living together. They lost, their friends had kind of had that magical crossing of the threshold into marriage to sort of mark, the beginning of their relationship.
Marriage does seem to be, so the stats say that it's very, very good, but fewer people are marrying, and they're generally marrying later. So why do you think that's the case?
So one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, I gave a talk on this 2 days ago in Washington, D.C., is what I'm calling the paradox of marriage. And that is, on the one hand, we're seeing marriage come down. I think that's really for four reasons. So the first is, I think, more economic inequality is making marriage harder for working class and poor UK, British and American young adults. I think we're also seeing kind of like people spending way too much time on these devices, on screens, which, makes it harder for them to kind of engage in kind of in-person socialization and socializing that would lead to marriage. The third thing is we're seeing a parallel, decline in religious and secular communities, which I think makes it more difficult to put a ring on it. And then the fourth thing is we're seeing kind of a breakdown in kind of common social norms that would orient people towards, what we call now normie behavior, when it comes to, dating and marriage and family as well. So these kind of shifts normatively, technologically, community-wise, and economically are all making marriage rarer in the US and the UK, and I'd say across the developed world. But the paradox here is that these very same larger social and cultural shifts are also making marriage that much more valuable. So, if you think about economic inequality, having the benefit of a spouse to either, pool the income with you or like go out into the workforce if you lose your job, and also to encourage you to be more prudent in your spending. Married couples are more prudent than, single adults are. Having the benefit of a spouse and a family to kind of keep you off a screen. I mean, if you're a halfway decent husband, halfway decent wife, mother, and father, you can't spend all your time online, right?
Well, let's hope not, anyway.
Well, exactly. And then the third thing in terms of we're seeing that kids are like little ambassadors. I mean, they take you to school. You meet the other parents at school. They take you to sports stuff. You have to go, ferry them to soccer or football practice in the UK. You've got to go to, sports events with them. And then for those of us who are religious, you take them to youth groups and to church on Sunday. So kids, are also having a family, I think tends to bring us out of our apartments and our homes in ways that are really profoundly important and valuable to us as social animals. And finally, I think being a husband, being a wife, being a mother and father is pushing you in a normie direction. I mean, your life is going to be more regular in terms of routines. You're going to be kind of more socially conservative, even if you don't adapt a conservative political identity, but you're going to be kind of just more inclined to, embrace, a more conventional way of life, if you will. And all of those things, I think, are particularly beneficial, for adults today. So you asked before about kids in marriage, and there's a reams of evidence that kids are benefiting from being stably, raised in a married household. But what I'm saying to you, Tony, today as well is I think the benefits of being stably married for men and women are increasing. And I have evidence of this when it comes to things like, for instance, loneliness in the US. There's an increased gap between those who are married with kids and those who are single and childless when it comes to being lonely. Same thing when it comes to complete satisfaction with life. We've got a new piece on Unheard coming out kind of on this spirit in the next couple of days, on your side of the pond. And then also financially, it's just no question that married folks are not just doing better financially in the US, they're doing markedly better than their unmarried peers. So bottom line is that, in some ways that sort of the tragedy of our moment is that marriage and family are receding at precisely the social moment when they're more valuable.
So you referred to the kind of the change in social expectations and social attitudes. How much of that do you think is orchestrated for whatever reason? How much of that do you think is just general slippage in a liberal democracy, let's say?
Well, I think what's happening right now is that our elites have this commitment to a kind of progressive, zeitgeist, a progressive way of thinking, progressive ethos. And so they assume that every departure, on the family front from the older way of doing things is a good thing because it's new, it's different, it's progress. But what they don't understand and appreciate is, as Edmund Burke, told us many, many years ago, is that not every tradition, obviously, but many of our traditions kind of emerged for a reason, for a sociological reason. And having marriage as a core institution is one of those kind of traditions. And it's an accident that in India, in Nigeria, in Egypt, and in the West, marriage emerged as a core institution. And we neglect that reality, at our peril. And unfortunately, our elites, who tend to be progressive and ever more progressive by the moment, have lost sight of that and have lost sight of the values and virtues that sustain strong marriages and strong families. So yeah, that's a problem. We have a big problem. And the other thing that I'm noting in this Unheard piece coming out shortly is that conservatives are doing markedly better than progressives when it comes to happiness and mental health. And that's
and of course that means something slightly different in the US to what it does in the UK, because we would associate those terms with political parties as opposed to kind of sociological attitudes, which is kind of a wider thing in the US, isn't it?
Yeah, but the funny thing about the UK and the US is that we are so similar in our fundamental demographic family trends. I mean, when I've been over to the UK to talk to people, but also just look at you do have data as well. And the basic story is extraordinarily similar. And that is just that educated and affluent Brits, educated and affluent Americans tend to marry and stay married today. They tend to have highly invested, involved parents, two parents raising the kids. And there's much more slippage when it comes to marriage for working class and poor Brits and Americans. And so I would hypothesize that in the United Kingdom, that people who broadly identify as conservative and those who identify as liberal, particularly younger adults, are going to be kind of stratified on the family front as well. That would be my hope. But anyways, we do see this in the US, and it's just a general kind of ethos, like mentality, and conservative adults, older, middle-aged young adults in the US are much more likely to be flourishing because marriage and family are much more important to them. They haven't bought into they're not drinking the progressive Kool-Aid today.
But the funny thing is, these progressive elites are very happy still to say, things like obesity is not good. So it's your choice to get large. If you want to get large, that's fine. But on a population basis, from a health perspective, obesity is not a good thing. They're fairly happy to say that. Yet when you look at the much greater evidence base for marriage as opposed to other relationships, yet they won't go there. It's quite bizarre.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm finding in my own research today is that progressive elites are what I call inverted hypocrites. And what I mean by that is that they perform better in private than they do in public. So they talk left in public, they walk right in private when it comes to so many things in the family. So just take one example, for instance. Who do you think has the highest share of male successful breadwinners?
Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean, so when you stratify the American, family income by, quintiles, what you find is that our richest Americans, who tend to be left-leaning politically and ideologically, have the most successful breadwinners. So there's this whole talk about, equality and androgyny and now gender flexibility, yada, yada, yada. But it's talk. It's not why. When it comes
it's that notion of luxury beliefs, isn't it? Really?
Exactly. Yeah. No. What Rob Henderson calls luxury beliefs. Is very much part and parcel of it. But and you look, all of us have pieces of our lives that are hypocritical, right? And let's obviously be honest and clear about that. So that's not really the bigger point here. Is not that our liberal elites are hypocritical, because you can do that. You can play that game with every group, right? But the problem here is that they don't use their cultural, their legal, and their economic power to reinforce stable marriage and strong families. That's the problem here. In fact, they talk this game about family diversity, everything that's completely disingenuous.
Yeah. And the people who suffer from that rhetoric and take it on board are the people who could best do with the benefits that marriage brings. The less well off in society, let's say, the poorer communities for whom marriage would make a huge difference are incentivized in many ways and encouraged from the rhetoric in the media, etc., not to do that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's I think the big challenge confronting the United States, the United Kingdom, and many other countries is that our elites are not using their influence and power and authority to reinforce the fundamental values and virtues that sustain strong and stable families, even as they embrace oftentimes these very virtues privately in their own homes.
I suppose that the $64,000 question, as some of the US would say, is, so what do we do about it? I mean, you can't turn the clock back. We are where we are. We've got laws in place that kind of, do and say certain things which point in different directions. In terms of the marriage debate, taking it forward, for those of us who think it is worthwhile promoting and keeping in society, what's the approach?
Yeah, the approach is sort of multifold. I think on the cultural front, we have to find new avenues of communicating to the general public. I think like the work that you're doing, that do workarounds that kind of conventional cultural platforms. That would be, I think, one recommendation. I think we have to recognize that we have to sort of create schools that have a very distinctive approach to, family formation. That's a big, tall order, but it's going to have to be done. We also have to recognize the importance of addressing what are called marriage penalties and, our public policies in the UK and the United States, and working with anyone who's kind of open-minded on this issue to sort of say to folks, look, it shouldn't be the case that if you get married in the UK, you're going to lose access to certain benefits that you would have access to if you kind of register or, apply as a single parent. And then on the economic front, think about ways to strengthen the position, particularly of working class men who are really struggling both in the United Kingdom and in the US, so that they can be, better husbands, better providers, better fathers. Because when men are not stably employed, they don't get married on average. And if they are married, they're much more likely to end up in divorce court as well. So the kinds of steps that we need to take. But I also think, there's a kind of a chin up kind of thing as well here, where folks who are, culturally conservative, committed to marriage and family, I think often sort of felt defensive about their position, given the sort of cultural forces arrayed against them. But we kind of, I grew up in the 70s, Star Wars, kind of like, we're like the, it's sort of, we're like the, the sort of Luke Skywalker kind of, I mean, we're definitely, under threat, and we're not in power, and, but the force is with us, we've actually got the truth on our side, and we've got to have a little more confidence that when we go into public arenas, we're talking with our friends over coffee or beers or whatever else, that, and to be honest with folks, like, look, if you can sort of, discount what I'm saying, you can deny what I'm talking about, but I'm sorry, if you can kind of keep it all together, when you're 75 and facing that cancer diagnosis, you're going to be doing a lot better, when your kids are, 15 years old and being tempted by a peer to, drink something or smoke something that they shouldn't, if you've kept it together on the home front, your kids are going to be doing much better then, and then also in the young adulthood. So just be very clear with folks. Look, I'm not trying to impose anything. I'm just trying to tell you kind of like, there is a better way and a worse way to do things. And this is what the data tell us. And you can pick the pathway to, the not so good destination. But if you would like to end up in a better place, both for yourself and for your children and even your grandchildren. I mean, the evidence even on intergenerational stuff here is powerful too. The choice is yours.
And you're right. If you ask young people, according to surveys, most young people, the vast majority, do actually want to settle down and get married to somebody of the opposite sex. It's what they want to do long term. So the desire is still there. You're quite right. There's something within us that just cleaves towards doing that thing.
Those aspirations require virtues and require sacrifices, right? So it's like, if you want to be in great physical shape as a, college athlete, and I think there are plenty of kids out there who would like to have that, kind of status. It's not enough to aspire to that. You've got to work hard to train to be a college athlete. And what we have to also stress too is that you don't willy-nilly land into a good marriage. You have to make sacrifices. You've got to put your wife first. You've got to recognize that your kids need your attention in the morning or the evening when you're tempted to be, on a screen, for instance. So there are all sorts of choices we have to sort of encourage folks to make. that are often difficult in the moment, but lead to long-term returns that are quite high.
And I think that's, again, it's part of our instant culture, isn't it? Of satisfaction now, which is a
Right.
larger problem and a larger
Yeah.
debate, maybe. What about the issue of and wrap up soon, because I know you've got lots of things on your agenda. I'm so grateful for your time. Monogamy is an interesting one because, again, I think even this morning when I was looking in the international press, 3 or 4 articles saying, should you try an open relationship? Here are the factors for a successful open relationship. And this is in mainstream media. This isn't, in quiet little journals in a corner somewhere. There seems to be a push for, if not polygamy, which, has appeared in a court in the US just in the last few days as a virtuous thing, then the idea of freshen up your relationship by, having an affair. What a great idea.
Well, we've already tried this. Swinging 70s in the U.S. didn't work out particularly well. I mean, all those couples ended up divorced and miserable. And then people are just naive too. I mean, polygamy is a very powerful institution cross-culturally and historically. If you want to open up, the law and culture to that, well, good luck to you. It's not particularly good for women. It's not particularly good for the kids who have, only a small share of their father's attention, So, yeah, I mean, it's just one more kind of ridiculous progressive idea that's sort of floating around there today. And I think anyone who's married kind of knows. I mean, we have, it's tough enough being emotionally and practically present to my wife and children. I can't even begin to imagine inserting some other character into this whole little lifestyle.
But you never see the corresponding article, why monogamy, why faithfulness, why, as you mentioned earlier on, the idea of committing, the idea of not indulging yourself for long-term gain is a really good thing. I spoke with Professor John Whitty Jr., who's written a book on monogamy from antiquity until the present day. Fantastic analytical brain, and the implications, the benefits of monogamy for wider society. In terms of the cultures that have survived and thrived were monogamous ones. And when they lost that, that's when they began to demise, if you like, just like Unwin says in his research back in the 1930s. It has significant impacts, not just on the couple, but on the culture, on the economy, on everything else like that.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, there's a big anthropological literature just showing us that there's a very strong association between monogamy and paternal investments, both financially and practically in kids. So when men are, monogamous, unseen, they're much more likely to invest financially and practically, emotionally in their kids. And so polyamory is a threat to involve fathers. It's also, unfortunately, no one wants to talk about this, but when you bring in unrelated male adults into the household, huge increase in risk for physical and sexual abuse of kids. So yeah, this whole polyamory thing is completely wrong if your primary concern is maximizing the welfare of children.
If you're putting children first, so if children's
Correct.
needs come
Yes.
beyond or ahead of adults' desires, if you like, then those things make
Correct.
sense.
Yeah.
Listen, Brad, it's such a huge privilege to talk to you. I know you're a busy guy. I think next time you're thinking about coming to the UK, or even separately, we need to invite you over to meet a lot of our people and to come and talk to us about all your wonderful research. I think you're doing you're one of the guys, one of the heroes that's making a difference, because the stats speak for themselves. They don't lie. The data is very, very clear, and you're one of the guys who's collecting that data and presenting it in a very clear manner. Brad, can I thank you so much for the work you're doing? Can I thank you so much for the evidence you're gathering, the clear stats that you're presenting? Could you tell us maybe just briefly what you're working on and what's coming up for you?
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be with you all, Tony. I've got a book coming out next year for HarperCollins on marriage, and I look forward to sharing that with you next year. So,
well, that's a date. Let's do that. Thank you very much,
okay.
Brad Wilcox. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thanks, Tony.